itself had been rewritten overnight. Words like gift, opportunity, and hope poured out like sweet honey, promising that this was a new dawn. But in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not smile. His hands tightened into a fist. He leaned forward, eyes steady, and whispered words that cut sharper than any blade. Behind their smiles, there is always a trap. Where the world saw mercy, he saw maneuver. Where the West declared generosity, he remembered centuries of chains hidden in treaties, loans, and agreements. And in that moment, he stood apart, not as a skeptic, but as a sentinel. Brothers and sisters, let us ask the question, can any gift be free when the ground beneath our feet holds gold, oil, and uranium worth billions? Before we begin this journey together, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Stay with us because what you are about to hear is not simply news, it is revelation. The celebration began like a chorus rehearsed long ago. In glass towers and marble halls, leaders of the International Monetary Fund declared what they called a triumph of compassion, $3 billion of African debt erased. The words rolled off their tongues like salvation, echoed by cameras printed in headlines, broadcast in polished sound bites across the world. From Washington to Paris, news anchors leaned into their microphones with gleaming eyes. They called it mercy. They called it progress. They called it history rewritten. Smiles stretched wide on television screens, as though the West had suddenly discovered a heart overflowing with generosity. But in Ouagadougou, the mood was different. In a small chamber, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat still, watching the same broadcast. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and with a voice so low it seemed carved out of stone, he uttered a warning. Behind their smiles, there is always a trap. That single sentence carried the weight of centuries. For while others applauded, he remembered. He remembered the loans that came with conditions. He remembered the austerity programs that bled nations dry. He remembered the structural adjustments that dismantled schools, hospitals, and industries across the continent. And he asked the question the headlines refused to print. Why now? Why, after decades of demanding repayment, would the IMF suddenly dress itself in the garments of mercy? Was it because Africa was weak? No. Was it because of a sudden moral awakening in the halls of power? Hardly. The soil of the continent itself held the answer. Beneath African ground lay more than $40 billion worth of gold, oil fields brimming with black wealth, and uranium critical to Europe's nuclear lifeline. And in such a world, no gift comes without strings. Western leaders posed for photographs, raising their glasses, their speeches dripping with the language of partnership. They wanted Africa to smile, to clap, to join the performance. But Traoré refused to play along. Instead, he asked the question that echoed like thunder. What does Africa give away in return? His suspicion was not cynicism. It was memory, the memory of colonial treaties disguised as cooperation, the memory of loans that bought not freedom, but dependence. For Traoré, the promise of debt relief did not sound like salvation. It sounded like the echo of chains clinking once more, this time forged in contracts instead of iron. And so, while much of the continent rushed forward, some governments signing papers with trembling hands, eager for the quick erasure of numbers on a balance sheet, Burkina Faso stood still. It did not cheer. It did not bow. It did not reach for the pen. What others celebrated as a miracle, Traoré saw as a mirage. For he knew that what is given today may be taken back tomorrow with interest. He knew that behind every clause, every vague phrase, every line of financial poetry, there could be hidden costs written in the blood of future generations. The contrast was striking. One African nation mortgaged nearly a quarter of its gold reserves, 25 tons worth more than $1.8 billion at current U.S. prices, simply to walk away with a clean balance sheet. Another signed away 40% of its offshore oil revenues for the next decade, trading future sovereignty for short-term applause. The cameras showed smiling faces, but the contracts told another story. A story where freedom was exchanged for collateral, where sovereignty was mortgaged, where wealth yet to be dug from the earth was already claimed by foreign hands. And so the question hung heavy in the air. What is debt relief when the price is your nation's lifeblood? In Ouagadougou, Captain Traoré held firm. He read the fine print, he listened between the lines, and he saw what others refused to see. For him, debt relief tied to gold, oil, and uranium was not generosity. It was repossession dressed in diplomacy. It was not partnership. It was purchase. The world called it freedom. He called it another form of chains. And so, while the applause thundered in the West, while markets cheered and balance sheets shifted, Burkina Faso stood apart. One leader, one voice, one decision, not to bend beneath the weight of smiling pressure. And the question lingers for us even now. What did he see in those quiet pages that others chose to ignore? When nations signed their names with hurried strokes of the pen, when contracts were sealed with handshakes beneath flashing cameras, Burkina Faso took another path. Traoré did not rush. He did not bend. Instead, he gathered a circle of men and women, not generals of war, but soldiers of numbers, auditors, economists, intelligence officers. He charged them with a single mission: to uncover the hidden truth behind the so-called relief. They dug through stacks of documents, analyzed offshore accounts, compared contracts to the colonial treaties of old, and slowly a chilling pattern began to emerge. The same extraction logic, the same silent siphoning, only now dressed in the language of 21st century finance. Debt relief, the IMF called it. But the clauses whispered another story. Repayment in case of default would not come in dollars, but in barrels of oil, in kilograms of uranium, in bars of gold. Worse still, the repayment would not even match global prices. Contracts demanded that oil be delivered at fixed discounts, 30% below market rates. Gold sold for $2,450 in New York was to be handed over for barely $1,650. It was a pawn shop contract disguised as salvation. Imagine it, a nation forced to sell its lifeblood cheap, generation after generation, just to claim it was free. Relief? Or robbery under another name? And then came the revelation that shook even the hardest skeptics. In the midst of their investigation, the team uncovered a leaked dossier stamped with 4 words: Phoenix Dollar Commodity Stabilization Program. The dossier laid bare a plan not whispered in African capitals, but drafted in Washington's backrooms, linked directly to advisors in the orbit of alleged Trump. Its contents were explosive. Africa's resources, gold, oil, uranium, were to become the backbone of a new digital dollar. This Phoenix Dollar, the documents declared, would serve as America's answer to China's rising digital yuan. But the foundation of this empire would not be innovation. It would be African soil. Projections written in cold figures told the tale. Just 5 African countries could anchor $500 billion in digital dollar issuance. Uranium from Burkina Faso alone, valued at more than $2.7 billion, was earmarked as a strategic stabilizer. Gold reserves across the Sahel, nearly 600 metric tons worth over $40 billion, were penciled in line by line as collateral for Washington's monetary ambitions. And so, the question rang louder: was this debt relief, or was it the quiet drafting of a new empire map, signed without Africa's consent? For Traoré, the answer was clear. This was not about kindness. It was not about partnership. It was about using Africa as collateral in a financial war between giants, a war fought not with soldiers, but with signatures, clauses, and digital codes. The choice now stood before him: remain silent, trade sovereignty for temporary applause, or strike back with a weapon far more dangerous than any army: truth. Traoré chose disclosure. He chose to arm his people with knowledge. He prepared a strategy not of secret bargaining, not of quiet diplomacy, but of revelation. He ordered that the contracts be read aloud on air, that charts and infographics be printed for students, that even village gatherings be shown the fine print. The message spread like wildfire. Farmers in Koudougou, teachers in Wahiguya, traders in Ouagadougou's Grand Marché, all saw with their own eyes the numbers that betrayed them. Gold stolen at a discount, oil mortgaged for decades, uranium pledged for a currency that would not even circulate in African hands. What began as suspicion became certainty. What began as whispers became a storm. Western media quickly struck back. Newspapers in New York and Paris dismissed the revelations as political theater. Editorials painted Traoré as reckless, naive, even dangerous. Alleged Trump himself went on television, calling the captain a radical soldier out of his depth. Yet for every headline that attacked his name, there was a document, a figure, a clause, circulating across WhatsApp groups, universities, and marketplaces. Numbers do not lie, and no character assassination could erase them. Inside Africa, the response was electric. Students debated sovereignty in Dakar lecture halls. Journalists in Lagos compared the IMF clauses to pawn shop deals. Economists in Nairobi calculated that what had been called relief was in truth a surrender of wealth. And slowly, admiration turned into action. Hashtags lit up across social media. Not relief but robbery. The Phoenix dollar trap. Protesters carried placards reading, "Our resources are not for sale." A movement was rising, and at its heart was one leader's refusal to sign, one leader's courage to see beyond the smiles. But the question remained, would the fire of revelation be enough to withstand the fury of empires? The moment of revelation spread not with whispers, but with fire. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré unfolded those contracts before the people, when he raised high the dossier-stamped Phoenix dollar commodity stabilization program, the silence of decades broke apart. For the first time, ordinary citizens could see, line by line, how their futures had been mortgaged in the language of relief. In Ouagadougou, screens flickered in crowded markets. Farmers leaned on their hoes, eyes wide as subtitles explained that gold valued at $2,450 an ounce in New York was to be exported at $1,650. Traders froze when they heard that barrels of oil selling for $75 globally were pledged away for barely $50. Teachers replayed the clips in classrooms, forcing their students to confront a lesson not from history books, but from the present moment. Disbelief turned to anger, anger turned to action. Within hours, hashtags erupted across social media. Such not relief but robbery. So Phoenix dollar trap. Songs were composed, remixed with video clips of Traoré's speech. Memes mocked the notion of mercy that demanded gold in return. The truth, once locked in legal jargon, now traveled through smartphones, sung in the language of the people. And then came the streets. In Ouagadougou, thousands marched with placards. Our resources are not for sale. In Bamako and Niamey, students poured into the roads, chanting that Africa's dignity was worth more than erased debts. In Lagos, journalists held live debates dissecting the clauses line by line. Even in Johannesburg, banners appeared outside financial institutions, declaring solidarity with Burkina Faso's stand. What began as one leader's act had become a continental chorus. Western capitals reacted with fury. The IMF issued official denials claiming Africa had misunderstood. Press releases described the contracts as innovative financial solutions, not traps. But Africans no longer relied on press releases. They had read the documents with their own eyes. And once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. Alleged Trump himself escalated the confrontation. In a televised address, he dismissed Traoré as a reckless soldier, unfit for economic leadership. He accused him of sabotaging opportunities for Africa and warned of consequences. Newspapers in New York and London followed suit, painting Burkina Faso's leader as a populist strongman, dangerous, unstable, anti-Western. French television went further, branding him hostile to investment, a threat to stability. But for every attack launched, another video spread across African networks, contracts circled in red ink, price sheets compared, emails leaked. And the people asked the simplest of questions. If this is false, why do they not show us the clean contracts? Why only words, never papers? The IMF and its allies underestimated one thing, the power of collective conviction. What once seemed distant, the world of contracts and balance sheets, had now been brought into village squares, university auditoriums, and church pulpits. Taxi drivers in Niamey debated collateral clauses. Farmers in Mali declared they would rather inherit debt than slavery disguised as freedom. Labor unions in Nairobi passed resolutions rejecting any attempt to mortgage their sweat for foreign currencies. The slogan grew louder, better hungry and free than full in chains. It became an anthem chanted in protests, painted on walls, echoed in songs. And with every repetition, it turned from a phrase into a creed. Markets trembled. In New York, gold futures spiked to $2,600 per ounce as rumors spread that Sahel nations might withhold supply. In Paris, uranium contracts surged 18%, threatening Europe's nuclear energy lifeline. Energy traders in London priced new risk premiums, fearful that oil shipments from West Africa might be redirected eastward. The financial world, once confident in its grip, now quivered at the thought of Africa saying no. Sanctions were threatened. Alleged Trump demanded harsher measures, asset freezes, export restrictions, punishments meant to bend the continent back into line. But instead of breaking spirits, his threats fueled defiance. Protesters carried bowls of empty rice as symbols, declaring that dignity was worth more than subsidized debt. Across the continent, voices rose in unison. If hunger is the price of freedom, then let us be hungry, but free. For the IMF, the crisis became existential. The very program it had paraded as a triumph now looked like a mask for exploitation. And for Africa, a truth emerged clearer than ever, that independence was never about flags or anthems alone. Independence was about sovereignty, control over resources, over decisions, over the future. And yet, in this moment of awakening, one question remained, heavy and urgent. Could Africa, united by outrage, turn its fury into lasting power? Or would the weight of sanctions, the storm of global finance, break its resolve once more? In Washington, the tone shifted from triumph to unease. What had been paraded as a $3 billion gift was now unraveling under the weight of public scrutiny. Financial analysts warned quietly that if even a handful of African nations refused IMF contracts, the entire program could collapse. What was sold as victory could become humiliation. The Phoenix Dollar Plan, once whispered in elite circles, now stood exposed before the world. Alleged Trump's advisors had envisioned Africa's resources as the foundation of a new digital empire, a currency war fought against Beijing's digital yuan. But when Captain Traoré laid bare the evidence, the illusion shattered. What was meant to project strength now looked like desperation. Markets trembled. Gold prices surged, uranium contracts spiked, oil traders recalculated risk premiums. In New York and London, hedge fund managers spoke of African risk with a nervous edge. In Paris, headlines warned that Europe's dependence on Sahel uranium, critical for nuclear power, had become a strategic vulnerability. Western media launched its counterattack. Editorials in the New York Times and Financial Times painted Traoré as reckless, a radical soldier jeopardizing Africa's economic stability. French broadcasters portrayed him as hostile, anti-Western, dangerous for investment. Yet their words collided with a new reality. Africans no longer needed interpretations from abroad. They had seen the contracts themselves. Across the continent, admiration deepened. In Dakar, students debated whether sovereignty was worth more than erased debts. In Lagos, journalists dissected IMF clauses like surgeons revealing a cancer. In Nairobi, economists recalculated long-term costs and concluded that what had been branded as mercy was in truth a mortgage of the future. And outside Africa, observers began to whisper what once seemed unthinkable. Could this be a precedent? Could resistance in the Sahel inspire South America or Southeast Asia to challenge similar deals? If Africa could stand tall, what stopped others from saying no to the same chains dressed in different names? For Brussels, the alarm was sharp. European leaders, already struggling with energy crises, faced the prospect that uranium shipments from Niger and Burkina Faso might dry up. Citizens began to ask whether their governments had traded long-term security for illusions of partnership. The mask of benevolence had slipped, and the costs were becoming visible. And so the question echoed across capitals, markets, and institutions alike. Was Africa's defiance the birth of a new era? An era in which the so-called Third World no longer bowed as pawn, but stood as player at the global table? The storm that began in whispers ended in thunder at Bamako. Under the blazing lights of an extraordinary summit, leaders of the Sahel Alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, stood shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with anticipation, history pressing against the walls. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose to speak, he did not speak only for his nation. His voice carried the weight of a continent weary of chains, yet unwilling to bow again. Alone they can sanction us, he declared, his voice steady, firm, unflinching. But united they cannot break us. The hall erupted in applause. For decades, African nations had been divided at the bargaining table, fractured by deals signed in secret, split by the illusion of individual gain. But now, for the first time in a generation, they were standing as one. Declarations followed. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, each announced the suspension of resource-backed IMF contracts. Their gold would not be pawned, their oil would not be mortgaged, their uranium would not be collateral. The symbolism was undeniable. Africa was no longer begging for relief, but setting its own terms. Behind closed doors, ministers whispered of new strategies, pooling gold reserves, negotiating with BRICS partners, exploring blockchain systems to secure trade beyond Western reach. Once, a single nation could be punished into submission. But united, they were building a shield. And beyond economics, there was a deeper truth. Cultural pride swelled. In Bamako's streets, musicians composed songs mocking the Phoenix dollar. Artists painted murals of Africa breaking chains forged in gold. Students marched with placards declaring, "Dignity above debt." What had begun as defiance was becoming identity. The world watched. In New York, analysts nervously recalculated commodity forecasts. In Brussels, officials whispered of strategic vulnerability. In Paris, citizens questioned why their electricity bills should depend on uranium mined in nations treated with disdain. And across Africa, ordinary people lifted their heads a little higher, for they had seen their leaders choose dignity over dependency. The Bamako summit was more than policy. It was proclamation. It declared that Africa's wealth was not for sale, that its future was not collateral, that sovereignty could no longer be bought with numbers erased on a balance sheet. And yet, the journey had only begun. The road ahead was uncertain, the challenges immense. But for the first time in decades, Africa was not merely reacting to the world's design, it was drawing its own map. The question now burns like fire. Can this spark of unity grow into a flame that guides the whole continent, perhaps even the whole global south, into a future free of hidden chains? The story of Africa's stand does not close with riches counted or debts erased. It closes with something far greater, dignity reclaimed. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and the voices rising from every corner of the continent have declared a truth the world can no longer ignore. True sovereignty is not measured by checks signed in Washington or contracts stamped in Brussels. True sovereignty is measured by the courage to say no, when no is just. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's defiance was not merely an act of politics. It was an act of faith, a belief that his people's future could not be mortgaged for temporary relief. In rejecting the contracts, in exposing the Phoenix dollar scheme tied to alleged Trump, he drew a line that resonated far beyond his borders. And now the question reaches us, here and now. If Traoré rejects reported 3B IMF relief on behalf of his people, what lessons do we learn for our own nations? Do we value short-term comfort more than long-term freedom? Do we trade away dignity for the illusion of generosity? Or do we, like Burkina Faso, find the strength to endure hardship rather than accept chains dressed as compassion? Brothers and sisters, the path forward is not easy. There will be sanctions. There will be pressures. There will be storms. But the storms cannot last forever. What lasts is the will of a people who decide that their children will inherit freedom, not pawn futures. So I ask you, when history calls, will you stand tall? When temptation comes wrapped in words like relief and partnership, will you ask, what is the price? For if Africa can say no, if Traoré rejects reported 3B IMF relief and inspires millions, then perhaps your nation too can reclaim its sovereignty. If this story stirred something in you, do not let it fade. Share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and above all, subscribe to this channel. Because the fight for dignity is not won in one speech or one summit. It is won when ordinary people, united in conviction,